I never imagined my 23rd birthday would be the day my family finally broke me. That morning, I woke up to the soft tapping of rain against my window. It was supposed to be a special day, a quiet celebration, maybe dinner with friends after work. I wasn't expecting gifts or a grand gesture. Honestly, I would have settled for a simple happy birthday from my mom, maybe a cake from the grocery store. I'd learned over the years not to expect too much. But what I didn't expect was the text that shattered everything. It came at 7:08 a.m., just as I was finishing my coffee before heading to my morning shift. My phone buzzed on the counter, and when I picked it up, my mother's name flashed across the screen. I smiled faintly, hopeful for even the smallest acknowledgement. I swiped to open the message. Sold your car. Alex needed a new gaming setup. Family helps each other. You'll also cover his student loan $10,000. Happy birthday. I froze, reading the words over and over, waiting for them to make sense. My car, the beat up Toyota Corolla, I'd bought outright after working two part time jobs for over a year. Gone, sold, without my permission, without even a conversation. I gripped the edge of the counter, my stomach twisting into knots. Surely this was some horrible joke. I texted back quickly. What are you talking about? You can't sell my car. The reply was instant. Don't start. Alex needs it. You should be grateful we raised you. Since you're so independent, you'll find a way to pay his loan too. Due in 2 weeks. Independence. That word stung like salt in an open wound. They had called me independent my whole life, but it wasn't praise. It was permission for them to take and take while I carried the weight of responsibility they never placed on my younger brother. I typed one more message, hands trembling. I'm not paying his loan. Her response came so fast, I knew she'd already written it, waiting to hit send. Then get out. You're cut off. Don't come back. Just like that on my birthday, I was exiled from my own family. There was no argument, no attempt to explain, no moment of hesitation. I had always known I was the second priority, but this was different. This was final. I should have cried, but I didn't. I just stood there, numb, staring at the cold words on my phone screen. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until the sound of my boss's car horn outside startled me. I was supposed to catch a ride with him that morning. Of course, my mom didn't think about how I'd get to work without a car. Maybe she didn't care. The workday passed in a fog. I waited tables, smiled automatically, wrote orders I couldn't remember taking. I was somewhere else, entirely locked in my own head, playing back every moment that had led me to this breaking point. All those birthdays they'd forgotten. All those nights I'd stayed late at work to help cover bills that now I realize weren't mine to pay. All those times I was told to understand when Alex got the things I couldn't even dare to ask for. The worst part wasn't that they'd sold my car. It wasn't even the money. It was the realization that I was never truly their daughter. I was their fallback plan. I was the solution to their problems. And the second I stopped playing that role, I became disposable. After work, I sat in the back alley behind the cafe, the smell of wet asphalt hanging heavy in the air, and stared at my phone again. No apology, no explanation, no second message asking if I was okay. I knew right then I couldn't go home. Not now, maybe not ever. The silence from them was louder than if they had screamed at me. I realized sitting there in my soaked uniform that this had been building for years. I had spent so long bending, sacrificing, making myself smaller, hoping they would one day see me not as a tool, but as their daughter. But maybe some families never see you. I pulled my phone from my pocket one last time and typed a message to my best friend Emily. I need a place to stay tonight. Her reply came back instantly. Always. That was the first crack of light breaking through the storm. I stood up, brushed the rain off my sleeves, and walked away from the only home I'd ever known, realizing maybe I was about to build something better. Looking back, I don't know why I was surprised. Maybe I wanted to believe that this time would be different, that maybe just maybe they would finally choose me. But the truth is, my family had been choosing Alex over me my entire life. The signs weren't subtle, they weren't hidden. They were glaring and loud, written across every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every school event I ever attended alone. When I was 6, I remember sitting at my own birthday party, waiting for my parents to arrive. They were late, of course. They were always late when it came to me. When they finally showed up, their faces were bright with excitement, not for me, but because they had just bought Alex his first electric toy car. You understand, right? My mom had whispered, brushing cake crumbs from my dress. He's younger. He needs the attention. That phrase would follow me like a shadow. You understand, right? I heard it when Alex smashed my favorite porcelain doll, and I was told to share. I heard it when he threw a tantrum over my birthday gift, and my parents bought him the exact same toy, only bigger. I heard it when I got straight A's and my mom skipped the school assembly because Alex had a dentist appointment. I understood all right. I understood that I was the placeholder, the background character in my own family. When I was 14, I saved for months to buy myself a secondhand camera. Photography was my passion. It made me feel seen in a world where I was often invisible. One afternoon, I came home to find Alex parading around with it strapped around his neck. He'd taken it to a skate park and dropped it, shattering the lens. When I told my parents, they shrugged. It's just a camera, my dad had said, waving me off. You can always buy another one. Alex didn't mean to. But somehow, Alex always didn't mean to. By the time I was 17, I'd stopped asking. I didn't bother inviting my family to my art showcase at school. I didn't ask for help with my college applications. I didn't even tell them when I won a local design competition. What was the point? When I landed my first part-time job at a coffee shop, my parents started borrowing from me almost immediately. Little things at first: gas money, groceries, school supplies for Alex. I told myself it was fine. I wanted to help. I wanted to believe we were a family that supported each other. But the borrowing never stopped. When I was 19, my father borrowed $1,000 to fix Alex's car after he rear-ended someone at a red light. Alex's only punishment was a brand new car 2 months later. When I asked when I'd be repaid, my mother sighed and said, "Amber, you're so good with money. You'll be fine. Alex is still figuring things out." I was always fine. I was always the one expected to adjust, to give, to sacrifice. The year I turned 20, I discovered the biggest betrayal yet. My grandparents had passed away when I was in high school, and I'd always been told they didn't leave anything behind. But a chance conversation with my Aunt Sophie revealed the truth. My grandparents had set aside education funds for both Alex and me. My fund had mysteriously vanished within 2 years, while Alex's was still intact. When I confronted my parents, they spun their story like seasoned politicians. There were emergencies, they said, unexpected expenses. They never explained what those expenses were. I didn't push further because I didn't want to believe they could take something that belonged to me. I didn't want to see the pattern, but it was always there. When Alex failed out of his first college program, they blamed the professors. When he dropped out of the second, they said the school wasn't a good fit. When he quit his job after 2 weeks because it was boring, my mother defended him passionately. He's creative. He just hasn't found his path yet. I worked double shifts to cover the bills when my father's hours were cut. I stayed up all night finishing freelance design work so we wouldn't fall behind on rent. But none of it was ever enough because I was the safety net. I was never supposed to be the one with dreams. I was supposed to be the one who made sure everyone else could chase theirs. The car sale wasn't just an isolated betrayal. It was the final act in a story I'd spent my whole life pretending wasn't being written. It was the moment I finally realized that love in my family was conditional. It was measured by what I could give, by how much I was willing to lose. And I wasn't willing to lose myself anymore. Maybe that's why the sting of being cut off hurt less than I expected, because somewhere deep inside I'd already let them go. The truth was I had been living alone emotionally for years. I just hadn't moved out yet. Leaving wasn't as dramatic as you might think. There was no screaming match, no last minute apologies, no slamming doors, just silence, the kind of silence that tells you you've been dismissed, erased, forgotten. After my mother's final text, "You're cut off. Don't come back," I stood in the center of my tiny bedroom surrounded by years of accumulated memories and realized that most of it didn't belong to me anymore. Sure, the clothes in the closet had my name on them. The photographs on the wall held my face, but they all sat on borrowed ground. I had been living in a house where nothing was ever truly mine. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. I just packed, quietly, methodically, like I was preparing for a trip I'd always known I would take. I started with the essentials: my clothes, my sketchbooks, a few battered paperbacks, my toothbrush. Then I hesitated over my photo albums, snapshots of childhood birthdays, Christmas mornings, family vacations, but something stopped me from putting them in the suitcase. It was like my body knew. Before my mind did, those photos didn't capture my memories. They captured the version of family I had tried so hard to believe in, the one where I belonged. But now, the illusion was gone, and those photos no longer held the weight they once did. I left them behind. I was careful to only take what I had earned, what I had bought with my own hands, my own paychecks. I didn't want to give them any reason to call me a thief, to accuse me of taking more than I deserved, because that's how they would frame it. That's how they had always framed it. When I zipped up the suitcase and slung my backpack over my shoulder, I paused in the doorway of my bedroom one last time. It was strangely easy to leave. Easier than I thought. Easier than it should have been. But I wasn't just walking out of a room. I was walking out of a role I'd been cast in since I was old enough to understand the word responsibility. On the kitchen table, I left behind something more valuable than any of my belongings. A folder, thick, heavy, filled with years of carefully collected evidence. You see, even though I'd been the obedient daughter, on the surface, quietly enduring the favoritism and double standards I had never stopped noticing. I had never stopped keeping track. I'd kept copies of bank statements showing suspicious withdrawals in my name even though I hadn't made them. I had printouts of every loan I was supposedly helping the family with, none of which had ever been repaid. I saved text messages where my parents informed me about money I was expected to contribute, never asked, always expected. I had records of utility bills I'd paid since I was 18. Rent I'd covered when my father lost his job. Even Alex's car repairs that somehow became my financial responsibility. For years, I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just part of being the older sibling, that family sacrifices weren't supposed to have balance sheets. But the deeper I dug, the harder it was to deny what I had been ignoring. I hadn't just been supporting my family. I had been financially exploited by them. The folder held it all. The numbers, the dates, the proof. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the truth finally having a voice. On top of the folder, I placed a note. My handwriting was steady, my words simple. This is what I've been carrying. I won't carry it anymore. I didn't expect them to read it that night. I didn't expect them to read it at all. But I needed to leave it for myself. It wasn't until I stepped outside pulling my suitcase down the cracked driveway that the first tear slipped down my cheek. It wasn't sadness, not entirely. It was a strange mix of grief, anger, and a surprising thread of relief. For the first time, the house behind me felt small, smaller than I remembered, like a place I had already outgrown. Emily was waiting for me a few blocks away. I had texted her earlier with nothing more than I need to go. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. When I slid into the passenger seat of her car, she looked over at me, her brow furrowed with concern. "Is this it?" she asked softly. I stared out at the dark road ahead, the weight of the folder still lingering in my mind. "Yeah," I whispered. "This is it." And as she pulled away, I didn't look back, because at this time I wasn't running. I was choosing myself. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that when your family pushes you out, you have to find the people who to pull you in. Emily wasn't just my best friend, she was my anchor. She'd seen it all, every disappointing birthday, every broken promise, every moment where I was expected to fold myself smaller so Alex could take up more space. She never judged me for staying too long, for giving too much. She simply waited for the day I'd finally say, I'm done. When I showed up at her apartment that night, dragging my suitcase behind me, like some tired traveler, she didn't flood me with questions. She just opened the door, hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and said, You're home now. That sentence, it nearly undid me, because it wasn't the place that felt like home. It was her. It was the safety of knowing that here no one was going to take from me. No one was going to demand pieces of me in exchange for conditional love. I slept on her couch that night, exhaustion pulling me under like a riptide. But the next morning, reality came crashing back in. I had nowhere to go. I had no car. I had no backup plan. The only thing I had was that folder sitting on my parents' kitchen table and the heavy silence that followed. Emily sat across from me at her tiny kitchen table, hands wrapped around her coffee mug. You can stay as long as you need. No rush. We'll figure it out. It had always been we with her. But even with Emily by my side, I knew I needed more. I needed someone who knew how to navigate family wars, someone who'd survived the same battlefield. So I called my Aunt Sophie Wells. Growing up, Sophie had always been the quiet outlier at family gatherings. She was my father's younger sister, but unlike him, she never played favorites. She never bought into the stories my parents spun about responsibility and sacrifice. When I was a teenager, she'd pulled me aside once at Christmas, her voice soft but steady. Amber, you don't have to earn your place in this family. Back then, I didn't know what to do with those words. I wasn't ready to believe them. But now, sitting on Emily's couch, I realized I'd always known Sophie would be the one person who wouldn't tell me to just get over it. When I called her, she answered on the second ring. Amber, sweetheart, are you okay? The sound of real concern in her voice cracked something open inside me. No, I whispered. They sold my car. They want me to pay Alex's debt. I said no, and now I'm out. She didn't miss a beat. Where are you now? With Emily. You're safe. I think so. Good. I'm coming to get you. Within an hour, Sophie was at Emily's door with her weathered minivan, the kind that smelled like peppermint and old receipts. When she hugged me, it wasn't stiff or reluctant. It was the kind of hug that says, You are not a burden here. We drove to her house, modest, peaceful, filled with sunlit windows and the faint smell of lavender. She offered me the guest room without hesitation, as if I'd always belonged there, as if this had always been my room, just waiting for me to find it. That afternoon, I sat at her kitchen table, watching the steam rise from our mugs of tea, and I told her everything. Not just about the car or the debt, but everything. The years of feeling small, the birthdays overshadowed, the endless borrowing, the education fund that mysteriously vanished. I told her about the folder I left behind, every page filled with proof I'd spent years too afraid to face. When I finished, Sophie just nodded, her gaze sharp but compassionate. I always suspected, she said quietly, but I didn't know the extent of it. She left the table briefly and returned with a thin manila envelope. Inside were copies of old family financial documents, statements, letters, trust paperwork I had never seen. You weren't the only one, she said. Your grandparents set up equal funds for you and Alex. I found out years ago that yours was being drained. I tried to question your father, but he shut me out. I regret not fighting harder. Her voice cracked on those last words. It's not too late, I told her, my throat tight. It's not too late to fight now. Together, we started building a case. Emily printed out the screenshots I'd saved. Sophie helped me sift through years of financial records. I called my bank, requested old statements. We mapped out every dollar, every lie, every manipulation. But it wasn't just about proving what had happened. It was about taking control. about reclaiming the narrative I'd been forced into. For the first time, I didn't feel alone in the fight. There was a quiet power in that, knowing that I had people behind me not because I owed them, but because they cared. Family isn't the people who share your blood, it's the people who help you pick up the pieces. I always believed the worst thing my parents ever did was sell my car, but I was wrong. That was just the surface. The real betrayal ran much deeper beneath the lies, beneath the daily manipulations buried so carefully, I almost missed it. It started when Aunt Sophie brought out the old paperwork one evening. We sat at her dining table, papers scattered between us like puzzle pieces, some yellowed with age, others fresh from her recent digging. Your grandparents set up a college trust for both you and Alex, she said, tapping a document with her finger. They were clear: equal amounts, equal opportunity. That word equal echoed in my head like an accusation. Nothing in my life had ever felt equal. But the trust is gone, I said, my stomach twisting. Dad told me it was lost. He said the market crashed when I was in high school. Sophie shook her head slowly. I don't think it was the market. That night, I sat with those papers spread across my bed for hours, my pulse hammering as I traced the flow of money. The trust should have been untouched until I graduated college. Instead, it had been slowly siphoned away year after year, the withdrawals disguised under routine family expenses, home improvements, Alex's summer camp's car repairs. But the part that made my blood run cold, the timeline didn't start in college. It started when I was 16, right after my grandparents passed away. I remembered that year vividly. It was the year I got my first job at a bakery. The year my parents suddenly asked me to contribute a little extra to the family's grocery bill. The year they told me money's tight, Amber. You're old enough to help. But money wasn't tight. Not really. They had access to my trust fund. And instead of telling me the truth, they drained it quietly, transaction by transaction, while teaching me that I owed them everything. It wasn't just the money they took. They stole my right to choose. If I'd known about that fund, maybe I wouldn't have worked myself to exhaustion juggling school and multiple jobs. Maybe I could have gone to the art program I turned down because it was too expensive. Maybe I wouldn't have spent years believing I was a burden. The more I uncovered, the harder it became to breathe. It wasn't just collateral damage. I was the fuel that kept the family afloat. Sophie helped me pull the final string when she contacted the trust administrator directly. She played it carefully, posing as a concerned family member requesting basic records. What came back confirmed everything. Alex's trust remained mostly intact. My parents had protected it like a sacred object. My trust, decimated. My father had used his position as trustee to authorize withdrawals. The explanations were vague: family emergencies, educational expenses, repairs, all things I'd been told I needed to pay for myself. And then came the final blow. 3 months before my 23rd birthday, a lump sum of $5,000 had been withdrawn from my trust and deposited directly into Alex's college account. His tuition, the very debt my parents demanded I pay, had already been covered with money that was mine. They'd taken from me and then tried to make me pay again. When Sophie told me, I went silent. I thought I might scream or cry or throw something, but instead I just sat there, my mind folding in on itself. How long had they planned this? Did they think I'd never notice? Or worse, did they think I'd notice and stay quiet anyway? That I would keep playing my role, keep absorbing the hits, because that's what I'd always done. Sophie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. This isn't your fault, she said, her voice firm. You didn't let this happen. They counted on you trusting them. Trust. That was the ugliest part. They hadn't stolen from a stranger. They'd stolen from their own daughter and trusted I would never fight back. But I was done being the silent one. The next morning, I called the trust attorney directly. I explained the situation calmly, even though my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sent over the documents I'd gathered, the records, the bank statements, everything. The attorney's response was immediate. This is serious financial misconduct. You may have legal grounds to challenge your father's role as trustee and recover some of these funds. For the first time, the scales tilted in my favor. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming what was mine, about drawing a line in the sand and saying, you don't get to decide my worth. You don't get to write this story. The trust wasn't just money. It was opportunity. It was freedom. It was the life I'd been told I couldn't afford. And now I was going to fight for it. For the girl who never thought she was allowed to. For me. Some moments in life sneak up on you. Others, you walk straight into them with your eyes wide open. The day I returned to confront my family was the second kind. I wasn't there for reconciliation. I wasn't there to beg for anything. I was there to return what they'd spent years dumping on me, the weight of their choices, the mountain of debts, the silence I had been forced to carry. When I pulled into the driveway that night, it was almost midnight. The street was quiet, but the tension in my chest roared like a storm. I'd borrowed Emily's car and I sat in it for a few extra minutes, staring at the porch light glowing dimly in the distance. This is the last time you ever walk into this house as their version of you, I told myself. I walked through the door using the same house key I'd carried since I was 16. I don't know why I thought they'd have changed the locks. Maybe part of them didn't think I'd have the nerve to come back. The house looked the same, but I didn't feel like I belonged there anymore. The kitchen counters still cluttered with mail. The faint smell of my mother's lavender cleaning spray in the air. My brother's backpack tossed carelessly by the couch. It was like stepping into a play I'd been written out of, but the script kept going without me. When I climbed the stairs to my room, I found the door wide open, the light spilling into the hall like a warning. I should have expected it. Alex stood in front of my mirror wearing one of my jackets. He was rifling through my things like they already belonged to him. He glanced at me completely unfazed. "Oh, you are here," he said as if I was the guest. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice steady but my pulse racing. "Mom said I could take whatever I want. You don't live here anymore." His words were so casual, so deeply rehearsed, I realized this was the story they'd already told themselves, that I had simply abandoned the family, so whatever I left behind was fair game. I scanned the room. My drawers were half open, clothes tossed everywhere, books gone. Even my portfolio, the one I'd spent years building, had pages ripped out. "Where's my portfolio, Alex?" "Mom said it's just some old sketches. She was going to throw it out, so I gave it to a friend for their art project." I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to breathe. The old Amber would have begged, pleaded, tried to explain why it mattered. But not this time. "Where's the rest of my stuff?" Alex shrugged. "Dad sold some of it. Said you wouldn't miss it." I wasn't surprised. I wasn't even angry anymore. It was like watching people drown in their own lies and calling it swimming. I started packing in silence, grabbing what was left that hadn't been claimed or sold. Alex watched me with mild curiosity, like I was some stranger passing through. As I zipped up my suitcase, he spoke again. "So, are you going to pay my student loan or what? Dad's pretty pissed." I turned to him steady and sharp. "No, I'm not." He blinked like I'd just spoken in another language. "Dad said you would. He already told the school the payment's coming." Then he lied to them, the same way he lied to me. Alex looked genuinely confused, as if it had never occurred to him that our parents could be wrong, or worse, that I could say no. "They told me you'd always take care of it," he said, his voice softer now. "That you knew how to handle things." Of course they did. That had always been my role. The fixer, the responsible one, the one who sacrifices. I zipped my bag and slung it over my shoulder. "You'll figure it out," I said as I walked past him. "You're grown now." When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I placed something on the kitchen table, a second folder. This one wasn't evidence. It wasn't for them to argue with or pick apart. It was a bill, a detailed invoice for everything they had taken from me. The trust withdrawals, the car they sold, the student loan they tried to pin on me, even the missing portfolio that now sat in some stranger's hands. On top of the folder, I left one final note. You always said family pays each other back. I agree. As I walked out of that house for the last time, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel grief. I felt light. I wasn't their safety net anymore. I wasn't their silent solution. I was the problem now, and for the first time in my life, that felt like freedom. Starting over isn't a single decision, it's thousands of tiny ones. I didn't wake up the next morning magically free of the weight my family had placed on me. In fact, the first few days felt heavier, like I was walking around with invisible chains I hadn't yet figured out how to cut. But the difference now was I wasn't carrying them alone. Aunt Sophie made me feel like I belonged in her house, not as a guest, but as someone who had a permanent seat at her table. Emily texted me daily sometimes just to remind me to eat. Even her cat Maverick seemed to adopt me curling up on my lap whenever I stopped by. The real work, though, started when I met with the trust's attorney. I expected complicated language, legal jargon I couldn't keep up with, but what I got was something far simpler: acknowledgement. This is financial abuse, the attorney told me, flipping through the copies I had provided, and you have every right to hold them accountable. Every right. It was the first time I'd heard those words applied to me. I filed a formal challenge to remove my father as trustee. The process was slow, full of paperwork and uncomfortable phone calls, but with Aunt Sophie and the trust lawyer in my corner, I didn't flinch. My parents didn't take it well. I heard about it from family friends and distant cousins who suddenly started reaching out, some to tell me I was brave, others to guilt me into dropping the case. One voicemail from my mother still echoes in my mind. She was crying, but even through the tears, she managed to twist the story. Amber, we did what we thought was best. You know how hard things were for us. Alex needed more support. You always understood that. You always knew we had to lean on you. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say she was wrong. She just reminded me of the old script. You knew. You allowed it. But not anymore. I didn't return the call. Instead, I focused on rebuilding what I had lost. I picked up extra shifts at a local print shop and began working on new designs to rebuild my portfolio from scratch. Sophie helped me find a reasonably priced used car. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, bought with my own money under my own name, no one else's hands on the steering wheel. One of the most surprising turns came from a small design firm downtown. They needed a junior designer part-time, and Emily knew the owner. I walked into the interview wearing thrifted clothes, holding a half-rebuilt portfolio, and expecting another rejection. But the creative director, a woman named Harper, looked at me with genuine interest. Tell me about a time you had to figure things out on your own, she asked. I could have told her a watered-down version. I could have glossed over the ugly details. But I didn't. I told her the truth, how I'd worked through school, how I'd had to start over, how I was still figuring things out, but determined not to quit. She smiled when I finished. We could use someone like you around here. That job became my first stepping stone back to myself. Bit by bit, I began to rebuild not just my career, but my sense of self. Sophie introduced me to her friends, people who didn't ask what I could provide, who simply wanted to know me. Emily dragged me to community events and weekend markets. Slowly, I found spaces where I wasn't the family's fixer. I was just Amber. Even Alex reached out eventually. A short, awkward text. Did you really leave the invoice? Mom's freaking out. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Yes, I meant it. His answer surprised me. I didn't know about the trust. I didn't know any of this. I wasn't ready to fully believe him, but I also wasn't ready to carry more anger. So I wrote back. It's your turn to figure things out now. The trust case eventually settled out of court. My father was removed as trustee, and the remaining funds, what little was left, were placed under new management directly accessible to me. It wasn't the full amount I'd lost, but it was enough to close that chapter. When I finally changed my phone number, blocking the calls I no longer needed to hear, I realized I wasn't running away from my family. I was running towards a life I should have had all along. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It's quiet. It's breathing easier. It's being able to answer your own phone without flinching. It's walking into your own apartment with the keys you paid for, sitting on furniture you chose, and knowing no one can take it from you. That is the life I was finally building. And for the first time, I wasn't building it for anyone else. 1 year later, I celebrated my 24th birthday in a place I could finally call my own. It wasn't grand, just a small apartment with scuffed hardwood floors, a cracked bathroom mirror, and a kitchen sink that sometimes whined when the water pressure acted up. But it was mine. Every inch of it, every fork in the drawer, every frame on the wall, every light switch I flipped, it all belonged to me. For the first time, my birthday wasn't something I dreaded. It wasn't a day I hoped would just pass quietly so no one could ruin it. This time, I wanted to celebrate. Emily helped me hang string lights across the living room, while Aunt Sophie insisted on bringing over her famous lemon bars. My new co-workers from the design studio came by with a homemade card covered in inside jokes from the past few months. And Maverick, Emily's cat, who had somehow claimed dual custody between us, curled up on my couch like he'd lived there all along. The most surprising guest, though, was Alex. We hadn't spoken much since the day I left the invoice on the kitchen table. His texts had been few and distant, scattered between what I suspected were moments when he finally started seeing the cracks in our family story. But when he knocked on my door that evening, holding a small, awkwardly wrapped package, I didn't feel anger. I just felt curiosity. He shuffled his feet and muttered, "Happy birthday." I let him in. Over pasta and cake, I realized he wasn't the same version of my brother I'd walked away from a year ago. He was quieter, less entitled. He told me he'd finally taken a job, a real one, working long hours at a shipping warehouse. It wasn't his dream, but it was his start. I didn't know, he said at one point, staring down at his plate. I really didn't know what they were doing to you. I believed what they told me. There was no dramatic apology, no sweeping redemption arc. But there was something real in his voice, something I wasn't used to hearing from him. "I get it now," he said, "and I'm sorry." I believed him. That didn't mean everything was instantly repaired. Some things take time. Some relationships need space to grow outside the shadows of the people who damaged them. Before he left, Alex handed me the small gift, a leather sketchbook with my initials embossed on the corner. Simple, thoughtful, entirely mine. "I know you're rebuilding," he said quietly. "I just thought you might want a new place to start." It wasn't the kind of gift our parents would have ever chosen. They bought things to fix the problems. Alex brought something that simply existed without expectation. As the evening wound down, Emily wrapped her arms around me in a bear hug that squeezed the air out of my lungs. Aunt Sophie kissed the top of my head. My coworkers teased me about being officially old now that I was in my mid-20s. I looked around the room and realized I had built this, not by accident, not because someone handed it to me, because I chose it. The family I had now wasn't perfect. They weren't tied to me by blood, but they were tied to me by choice, by kindness, by the simple, beautiful act of showing up. My parents still tried to reach out sometimes. A card would arrive in the mail, the handwriting familiar, but the words empty. "We miss you. You'll always be our daughter." But missing someone isn't the same as valuing them, and blood isn't enough to erase the weight of what they took from me. I no longer responded. I didn't hate them. I just didn't need them. My family wasn't something I was born into anymore. It was something I carefully, intentionally built. People who celebrated me not because I served a purpose, but simply because I existed. I still went to therapy, still worked on unpacking the guilt that sometimes clung to me like a second skin. But the shame, that was gone. I wasn't ashamed of walking away. I wasn't ashamed of setting boundaries. I was proud. When I visited Aunt Sophie's house a few weeks later, she handed me a small envelope with my name written in her looping script. Inside was a simple note. "You were never the problem. You were the beginning of the solution." Sometimes I think about that old version of me, The girl who would have given everything just to be chosen by the people who were supposed to love her first. I wonder what she would think if she could see me now. I think she'd be proud too. Rebuilding wasn't about revenge, it was about freedom. It was about saying, I get to decide who has access to me. I get to choose who comes with me into the life I'm creating. And maybe that's the most powerful thing we can ever give ourselves. I didn't get the family I wanted, but I got the family I chose. And in the end, that's worth everything. Looking back, I've realized that some of the hardest lessons I've learned came from the people I thought would protect me. For most of my life, I believed that family was sacred, unchangeable, unconditional, permanent. I believed that no matter how much it hurt, I had to stay to give to carry the weight because that's what family does. But what I've come to understand is this family is not just about blood, it's about how people treat you. Love isn't real if it's conditional. Support doesn't count if it only shows up when it benefits them. The people who truly love you don't ask you to break yourself so they can stay whole. For years, I allowed myself to be used because I didn't know I could say no. I confused obligation with loyalty. I thought setting boundaries made me selfish. I thought walking away made me cruel. But what I've learned is that walking away when you are consistently disrespected is one of the bravest, most loving things you can do for yourself. Saying no doesn't mean you don't care. It means you've decided to care about yourself too. That's something I wish I'd learned sooner. I've also learned that rebuilding isn't instant, it's slow. Some days it feels like you're making progress. Other days you question whether you did the right thing at all. But every step you take toward building a life where you're respected is a step worth taking. There's a specific kind of freedom that comes when you realize you can create your own family. People who show up because they want to, not because they're tied to you by birth. Friends who become family. Mentors who believe in you. Communities that lift you up. If you've ever been in a situation where you've given everything, where you've twisted yourself into knots to be enough for someone who keeps moving the finish line, please know you're allowed to stop. You're allowed to choose yourself. You're allowed to walk away from people who only love you when you're useful. You are not selfish for wanting peace. You are not cruel for demanding respect. I used to think I needed their approval to have a life worth living. Now I know I just needed my own.